I wanted to let you know, Dr. Curry, because I'm a longtime fan of your work. I was
Thank you.
trying to get you on the show for a while. I was not even aware of your recent controversy. I had actually realized how bad it had gotten
Hmm.
after you already agreed to be on the show. I don't want to make you talk about it too much, but it had to do with conservatives, and you're not the only one. There have been several kind of
Right,
witch hunts of
right.
professors. What would you like to share about that in a general sense, not just about yourself, but just about how it's been going with professors in general, and where you
Yeah.
think this recent witch hunt is coming from?
Well, a few things about that. So, for those of you who don't know, I was attacked by Rod Dreher, who is a blogger with a bachelor's degree in journalism, who believes that he can have an audience with tenured black professors on nothing more beyond with nothing to bring to the table beyond his accusations. So a podcast I did in 2012 on Django Unchained resurfaced because it had a provocative title called "Kill." I think it was titled something like "Killing White People" or "Killing White People in Context." And Rod Dreher, he says that somebody complained about me, so he went and looked me up. He went fishing for something and chose this podcast. Basically, the podcast argues that Jamie Foxx's articulation of Django Unchained, which is where he made this comment saying that he enjoyed being able to kill the white people who enslaved black people, and that it was a fantasy of his. He got a lot of flack of that from that. So basically, he made a comment about revolutionary violence and how white people who enslaved black people or Africans deserved it, and how that was a fantasy. And my point was to say, well, listen, yes, it's a fantasy, but it also happened, right? There were slave uprisings. There have been long conversations about the use of armed resistance and militancy in fighting for black civil rights. And one of the things that I pointed out is that in this tradition, there have been black people who have believed wholeheartedly that the only way that black people could get free is if some white people died. And this argument was advanced by people like Ida B. Wells and Robert F. Williams because they suggested that white people who fundamentally believed in the notion of white superiority and white supremacy would never trade their white superior lives for black inferior lives. So this is a calculation that black people can use in trying to defend themselves against mob violence, lynching, and the KKK. So, of course, Rod Dreher, being the white supremacist that he is, took that line out of context, suggested I was advocating killing white people, despite the fact that the whole segment is about black self-defense and the history of black militancy, and suggested somehow that I'm some radical that's running loose by the lips, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Most recently, he published a piece in response to the Chronicle article suggesting that, well, because 10 years ago when I was a grad student, I wrote a piece about revolutionary violence, that this is truly what I believe, and that, I'm inciting children in my classes to go out and kill white people. It's nonsensical. My work primarily revolves around militancy. I pretty much write about Ida B. Wells, T. Thomas Fortune, and Robert F. Williams and their philosophies of self-defense. The last article I published actually in this area was with a white undergraduate student on Robert F. Williams and preemptive self-defense. So, this is conservatives and the alt-right trying to demonize a young black male professor because it's in vogue right now. The idea that black men are violent, the idea that black men are militants, the idea that black men are trying to stamp out and threaten the white race has been part of the racist trope in America for centuries on end. So that's not going to end anytime soon. But I think what's most important about this kind of controversy is two things. The first being that it really does expose the kinds of racist machinations within research universities in this country, namely that places like Texas A&M are taking this kind of stuff seriously. This story hasn't broken on any legitimate journalistic source. It's been confined to alt-right and white supremacist websites. So the fact that a major research university even believes that this is legitimate, that we have to take white supremacists seriously, is a joke to me. The second thing, however, though, is that the empowerment of this kind of public, now the alt-right and white supremacists are in fact a public that universities are taking seriously, means that black scholars and other white liberals or leftists who are speaking about race and the history of racism easily become targets. So when you look around the country, you see several different professors being targeted for tweets that they've made or for Facebook posts that they've shared. And this is just another way to intimidate and silence people who are fighting against racism. So under Trump and under the kind of ethno-nationalist backlash that we had to Obama, we can see a shift in public consciousness. We can see that white supremacists now have a forum, that they're in the public square, and that it's actually becoming quite dangerous for people of color.
Yes, and what you said is actually something I was about to bring up. I was catching up on the controversy through a Chronicle article, and two things that jumped out at me. Both, I was shocked at the extent to which Dreyer was entertained, like the type of moral equivalency that he was given. Almost like it blew my mind, because anyone who has listened to you speak or read your work, your scholarship is very thorough.
Thank you.
Layer footnotes and references very, very thoroughly. And when people even see your pedigree and your history debating, and then this guy who's just I've read about Dreyer and I just still don't understand why he's so popular, but it reinforces this idea that as a black man, you have to be so thorough and you're still not equivalent to even the most random white man with the least credentials and overt history of white supremacist transgressions.
Absolutely. I mean, Dreyer is going to pull a white public that's fearful of black men. I mean, I think that his interview in the Chronicle where he exposes that he shuddered when black men passed him by because he was so scared they would do violence to him. I mean, this is indicative of a history of racial bias and racial antipathy. And as I say in my work, this is indicative of a kind of anti-black misandry, a fear and hatred of black men. And the fact that he just communicates this to people so easily really does suggest that he's a racist. And what's funny to me about this. But what's funny about this is, you got to think. I mean, the guy's already been proven wrong by every major journalistic or reputable journalistic outlet that covers higher education. And he's still trying to persist. He's like, well, look at this article he publishes when he was 24 or 25 years old. I'm like, really, this is, if he understood anything about academia, he would understand that sometimes you ask questions to explore whether or not these things are possible. Right? That if I'm asking the question about whether or not they should be revolutionary violence or should there be a more robust sense of self-defense, I'm asking the question to wage an argument to decide what's the strongest case. That doesn't mean that I have to advocate revolutionary violence. Said differently, if someone says, well, let's talk about war, just war. Do we have a right to wage a war against the Middle East? And you ask this in a philosophy class under just war theory. That doesn't mean that they advocate war in the Middle East, right? But the problem is when a black male says this, when a black professor says this, you say that there is no intellectual function of such questions. It's only politics or it's only racial hate or aversion. And again, I anticipated all this in my article, the pieces that he's just didn't, quote. I'm saying, look, for people to ask a question, for black people, specifically for a black man to ask a question about whether or not revolutionary violence is needed after a catastrophe like Katrina, and histories of racial discrimination is going to be met with fear and paranoia by some whites. But those whites are racist because they ask these questions in everyday situations. You ask this question in social contract theory. You ask these questions in war or military ethics. You ask these questions in basic classes about ethics and self-defense. The only difference is when you apply to a racial context, people suggest that it's out of bounds because you're talking about the lives of white people, as if black people don't deal with the unjust killing of their own race on a daily basis. So, I don't really take him seriously. I mean, the guy only has a bachelor's degree, so he clearly is not familiar with how academic prose and academic work, articles, peer review work is actually done. So he's a conservative white man that has an axe to grind against liberals, who thinks he's the most oppressed group because of his Christian origins, his Catholicism, and he's certainly within bounds to express that opinion. But insofar as he actually believes that there's a commentary worth having with him about work and tradition that he doesn't understand, I'm beyond that. And I think that it's indicative of the kind of racism that exists in this country, where I'm somehow expected as a professor at a research institution to lower myself to debate with bloggers simply on the assertion that they're just as intelligent than I am. That may very well be the case as him as an individual, but he doesn't have the hours put in yet to have this kind of argument with me. And if he chose to, he could certainly submit it to a peer review publication. I'll be happy to debate it with him then.
And this is the last thing I'm going to say about that, because I don't want to dwell on it too long, but there's a certain disingenuousness about him pretending that he doesn't understand about posing questions for the purpose of exploring and answering them. Because, I mean, this is a tradition that goes back to Plato in his works when he's discussing Socrates. And these conservatives do that all the time when, they always pull the just asking questions card when
of course
it's time to talk about, hey, are black people latent rapists? Are they inherently genetically stupid? Do they have genetic propensities to crime? Hey, we're just asking questions.
Right, we're just doing research, right? We're just asking the academic question. I mean, look, that's what this is smoke and mirrors, right?
Yeah,
I mean, he has a reactionary white public under Trump that's going to be fearful. They're going to buy into the idea that white people are the most vulnerable and the most endangered group in America, that affirmative action and diversity means the extinction of the white race. He already has that. And, he's going, of course, like any white conservative, he's going to deny this because he's going to say, well, I'm not a white supremacist. Yeah, but when you look at who picks up your stories, they're all alt-right and white supremacists. Right, your stories are shared and endorsed by people who that is your public. Right, they're endorsed by people who believe these things. When you look at when you track these things, when you track how his stories and his work is being shared, especially in regard to me and other professors. He's attacked a few of my colleagues as well. You see that that's the people who are trying to endorse his view. Right. The Daily Stormer, the Daily Caller, Amaranth. Right. These are clear white supremacist sites. So, InfoWars, another white supremacist site. So, when you have people who think that, human gorilla hybrids are the threat to Western civilization, there's no reason to argue with these people. This is the quality of the intellectual debates that you're going to get from white supremacists. And while Dreyer may try to separate himself from that under the guise of paleoconservatism or whatever he wants to call himself, or his conservative views, that's not really fooling anyone. Right, the guy has clear racial biases, and I think, for instance, that is why he's choosing to pick on me. It's an easy target. He has issues with black men. He's admitted he has issues and fears of black men.
Yes, overtly.
I'm a black man. Yeah, he's overtly said it, right? So he has fears of black men. He wants to tackle black men, so he's gonna ride this out as long as he can.
And to tie it into the title of your book, I think this is a good segue. The reason why I think that he can quote unquote get it when it's time for, Plato talking about Socrates just asking questions, or when it's time for a race scientist, I say scientist in quotation marks, like Charles Murray, to be just asking questions is because to them, a white man is a human. He's a man.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
he's using his intellect. But because as a black man, you're not quite a man. You're not quite an animal. When you ask the
Right.
questions, you're reacting to impulse. You can't ask the question just as an abstraction. You know, you must be just getting ready to incite a riot like
Violent, exactly.
Planet
I'm
of
just
the Apes.
primal rage.
Yes,
Yeah, I mean this is what I'm saying, right? The whole aspect, reeks of the kind of racism that black men and black people generally, but more so black men, just because of how they're stereotyped, have to endure in this country. So the idea that I can't ask intelligent questions, the idea that somehow I'm intellectually immature, that I'm just trying to incite people, none of these things have anything to do with
It's not even an
fact.
option that you're going to intellectually explore this with, real academic rigor.
Yeah, I mean, for them, it's like, oh, he writes a paper about violence, and and then it's just a sophomoric effort, right? I mean, evidently, some conservatives came into my classes and they spliced some tapes, and it is ironic. I mean, here's the funny part: at the beginning of every class, when we start talking about violence, I literally have this speech that I've written into my notes, or that I just remember to say every class. And when we start the chapters, I say, listen, this is a conservative university, so we know there are going to be people who are going to say that Dr. Curry is saying kill white people. But that's not the argument. The argument is that revolutionary violence is self-defense. So I have this whole spiel to prime the students to understand exactly what we're talking about. So you had somebody come in, they've clearly spliced that section, right, of the talk. And they're saying, oh, well, Curry's advocating violence. And you can actually listen to the splices where I'm saying George Jackson argues, right? Or Fanon argues. And they're like, well, do you think violence is? I was like, well, in this situation or in this context, if we assume, racism is permanent, then yes, the only way that you're going to get any kind of change is the destruction of the dominant class, or the removal of white people, or the killing of white people, or revolution. Those types of things are said in all kinds of different ways when you're lecturing to people. So the idea that these are somehow taken as personal opinions rather than reflections on text or within the context of a certain discussion is just silly to me. But this is what the alt-right has to do. They have to make people, black people, leftists, liberals, they have to make people seem as if they're incompetent. They have to make people seem as they're purely rhetorical. And that's just not going to work in this case. Like I said, I mean, the work I do on militant self-defense, I think I've published 4 or 5 articles. At this point, I've published over 60. So that's not even 1% of, or 10% of the work that I've done, especially if you count the books that I do on a general and regular basis. So, I think we need to be very clear about what their agenda is. They're trying to pull something from basically 10% of a career to make that seem as if it represents everything and anything that I think about on a constant basis. Well, I think that every philosopher is given the image of a gadfly to understand the kinds of questions that we should be asking. We're taught from undergrad forward that the idea of the philosopher is to ask the questions that no one wants to even hear or think about, to ruffle the feathers of the masses so that they take a moment to think, what if? And I think that that's a useful idea. It's a useful image. But in the real world, once you get your degree, when you're actually a practicing philosopher, especially under this presidential administration, it seems that there is a tendency for gadflies and critical thinking to not only be deemed undesirable, but to also be extremely dangerous. So, and I want to say that I'm not the only professor that's had their life threatened over the last month or so because they said something that the alt-right or the American conservatives have not liked about race or race relations. There's a number of professors that have been threatened to be killed, threatened to be raped. People have called, threatened to lynch me because they said that I was a rapist. That's some of the death threats that I received. So what we're entering right now is a kind of time period where no question can be asked if it runs against the narrative of, the extreme right, which is there should be no discussions of anti-racism, that America solved its race problem, that white people, in particular white men, are not to blame and have no They have no obligation to deal with racism. And the other part of this is this kind of insidious notion of racial inferiority and cultural deprivation theory, which suggests that the problems that Black Americans find themselves in, be it police brutality or poverty, ultimately come from an aspect of their own racial inferiority, be it biological or cultural. So in some of the websites that have posted and shared this story, you see them also sharing some of the work of the bell curve that's also talking about the rise of whites to reclaim the republic. You see a lot of stuff by David Duke suggesting there needs to be a mobilization of whites, specifically white men, against the language of the academy that is weakening the white race. You see people sharing Richard Spencer's stuff on the alt-right. So this is part of a program, a movement that is not just popular, that is no longer on the fringes of American society, but something that has kind of gained a central foundation or position or platform in the way that Americans are now trying to deal with or, I suppose, address America's race relations. And to be a gadfly or a Black gadfly in this period of time, talking about race has made it extremely dangerous. This kind of harkens back to what we knew of as, in the McCarthy era, something that's also remnant of how Black professors were treated during the Civil Rights Movement, where the FBI or the government would threaten their jobs or their lives, their livelihood, if they spoke out against the United States government on race. So we're heading back to some very dark times.
Wow. Now, there were a couple of references that not all our listeners may know or that people may want to or be able to hear more about valuably. The first one I want to mention and bring up is the notion of the alt-right. My understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, Tommy, or fill this in for us if you would. My understanding is that the alt-right is kind of a euphemism. It's a new name for something. Is it for neo-Nazis? What is it a new name for?
Well, some people are referring to it as an intellectual movement that's trying to take the failure of the right to address some of the core issues of the ideas of conservatism back to the white republic. So for many people, the right or the conservative movement did not go far enough in protecting and safeguarding the white race. This is both a political movement and an intellectual movement. So you could see in some of the earlier writings that Richard Spencer actually did on the American Conservative, which was the publication that broke the news allegedly about, my support of violence or armed self-defense. He actually used to be a writer there before he was fired. But this group of individuals, the intellectual forefathers of this movement, seem to believe that there's also a stake in America being a white republic. So it's a very old civilizational argument as to what it means to be an American, but even more so politically, what kinds of trade-offs are involved when other minority groups progress. Specifically, it's one of the key ideas is as other groups progress in this society, white men, and by default, the white race, becomes weaker and lose out. So one of the major arguments that I think caught the attention of the American Conservative and other white supremacist, publications in this regard is that a Black person arguing that Black people have the right of self-defense against white supremacy is seen as a real threat to the kind of life and population concerns that the alt-right is suggesting the white race suffer under. Remember, the argument that many people claim on this side of the political spectrum is that there's an ongoing white genocide, that because white people are producing at lower numbers, because the white race will no longer be the majority race in a couple of decades, that this is in fact foreshadowing the extermination of the white race in America. And this kind of fear and paranoia has generated certain kinds of calls for censorship, population control, immigration, right? I believe I discussed when I was on before how when we look at Trump and the right's politics, then his laws on his policies on immigration and his policies on abortion make perfect sense if you're looking at it from a turn of the century ethnological standpoint, which is that you have to have white women reproduce, you have to limit the number of potential non-white suitors through immigration, and then those people within the borders of your country, you have to exterminate or at least segregate in such a way that they don't reproduce or threaten the endogamy of the white race. So these are the endogamy, the ability for intermarriage within the group.
Thank you.
So So you have to make sure that whites marry whites, that whites reproduce with whites, and that there's a kind of cultural affinity between whites that makes it undesirable to intermarry or mix with other groups. And as I say, these are very old ideas. These are actually the ideas that I study the most on because I do intellectual history of the 19th century. So this is a period of time in the 21st century that Trump and a lot of the far right are moving to some very insidiously racist, insidiously isolationist and xenophobic ideas to trying to make America a white republic again.
That's very helpful. And so in a sense, neo-Nazi is kind of a way too simple a term. At bottom, though, this is a white supremacist group. Very interesting. The other term you used and mentioned was the bell curve. And if I'm not mistaken, this was by Charles Murray, right?
Yes.
And it was this text that was focusing on IQ and the notion of differences between the races when it comes to IQ, which, of course, has then been taken up and been an inspiration for a number of people in this movement that you're talking about. Who what do they celebrate this text?
They celebrate the text, and in many ways they suggest that the text is indicative of the kind of degrading the devolution, I should say, of the American citizen. So for many of these people that's on these white supremacist websites, like the Daily Stormer, et cetera, a lot of the arguments assume that the more that races mix with the white race, the more it devolves the white race from its proper place. So again, you have the biogenetic arguments, or what we used to call in school biological determinist arguments, right? You have that kind of racism creeping up. You do have this kind of alt-right, which is much more aligned with an intellectual defense of white supremacy. And that's one of the reasons that they try to distance themselves from Nazism. I think for the most part, people have attacked the alt-right, not inappropriately for being white supremacists, but they've done it on the idea of the old school biological determinacy that you get out of Nazism. The superior white race can't be polluted with inferior races. And there's certainly that in the white supremacist milieu of all these people. But the alt-right is actually taking up a very interesting spin. The alt-right is suggesting that they're now the minority group. And because they're the minority group, that all the postmodern theories of standpoint epistemology and all the postmodern theories of, the revolutionary, the minority, proletariat, et cetera, they've adopted all those paradigms. And they simply said, white men or white people are the coming minority. So we know best. Our experiences have to be heard. And these are movements to protect ourselves. So that's why people like Richard Spencer are now able to claim, we're not anti-other groups. We're just pro-us. And by saying that we're pro-us, he's not saying, we're pro-white. He's saying we're pro the people who are suffering as white men, as poor whites, as white Americans who've been stamped out by affirmative action policies, liberalism, et cetera. Right. So he's utilized the discourses that we've been doing in the academy for the last 20 or 30 years to put it around a certain population and story that focuses on white Americans.
Hence the intellectual element, right?
Exactly.
Right,
so people have been, so this is why they get out of claiming they're a neo-Nazi hate group, right?
Gotcha.
They're not saying, white people should triumph over the world. They're saying America should be a white republic because of these cultural ideas. And these cultural ideas have been stamped out by this kind of progressivism that has disadvantaged white people, specifically white men. And this needs to be an American white male republic because they have experiences too. They're suffering too. There's certain notions of memory that's being erased, as in the Confederate statues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. While and I want to be clear, it's a rhetorical device to kind of put a progressive face on its white supremacy. But we should make no mistake that these people are calling for censorship. They're calling for racial superiority. And they're trying to hearken America back to a day where it was unquestionably and undoubtedly a white republic.
A lot of people on the alt-right, so who take the alt-right position, do see themselves as gadflies, right?
Isn't the interesting thing, though, that they'll never really receive death threats the way Tommy has for that?
Oh, Richard Spencer. I mean, he got punched in the face.
Oh, okay.
He did get punched in the face. But here's the thing. Here's the thing, right? Is that when you're in 2010, when Richard Spencer, started coining and popularizing this term, the idea was kind of set into motion by previous reactions to conservatives not going far enough. Right. When you look at, like paleo conservatives, when you look at the responses and reactions against multiculturalism and immigration and
wait, what is a paleo what now?
A paleo conservative. So
what is that for our listeners? And I'm one of the people who doesn't know exactly
and for
what
me,
that is.
I've never heard this term before.
Well, this guy named Godfrey came up with the term. And again, the interesting thing about the conservative movement is it tries to conserve certain ideas and values, but sometimes people don't think they go far enough. So there's a difference between conservative and ideal and saying that there should be no immigrants, no blacks, et cetera, in the country. Paleo conservatives were a reaction against mainstream conservatism, which felt that it had in many ways lost its way. So this was in the late 2000s. I think it was 2007, 2008, when Godfrey wrote this essay on paleo conservatism. In 2010, you really see Richard Spencer kind of picking this ideology up by coining the alternative right. But this becomes a way to talk about the cultural and the idealistic constitution of the white race, the ideas that made white America great, right? This is where you really see Trump getting a lot of his pull. Make America great again. The reason that speaks to so many people of that class, so many white people, motivated so many white voters, was because it really does make America white again. Because the people who are saying that they're victimized by immigration, by affirmative action, by the economic crisis, have been white Americans. And this is going not only into what concretely affects them, but also their ideas in history, the Confederacy, right? Immigration policies, religion. One of the reasons Islam is such a big deal now is because they see themselves as white Christians. Yeah, so these are major parts of the alt-right and the ideological movement that focus around race, even though race is being displaced from it. So it's easy to have a conversation about Islam, people who are Muslims as terrorists, blacks who are criminals, Mexicans who are rapists, without really focusing on the need for America to still be a white supremacist republic. And what that is looking like now is this call for censorship. Right. So every time a professor in the leftist university makes a claim against America, makes a claim against the white race, says the white race is disposable, you get this outpouring of outrage. Right. It's this false aversion to the idea that someone's somehow going to eliminate the white race from the face of the earth. And it's between this intellectual and political movement that's calling for the empowerment of whites, specifically white men, and then the at-large popular movement, which calls for the censorship of any view that's against the alt-right ideology, that you find most academics today. Yeah. Which is why you found these backlashes. If someone says black people should defend themselves, you say racism doesn't exist, so this is hate speech, right? If you say that white people are inciting violence and vigilantism, and, a colleague of mine, Dr. Williams at Trinity, shared a piece where he's like, listen, these people have incited violence, have killed. He's like, fine. She shared Son of Baldwin's piece with the hashtag let them die. In no way did he advocate, in fact, killing anyone. They say, he too was trying to kill white people. Right. So this is the kind of reactionism that universities are going to find themselves in the next, 4 to 8 years. God, let's hope it's not 8, but 4 to 8 years possible. So on March 8th, I got an email from Tucker Carlson's, producer saying that they wanted me on the show to talk about healthcare and race issues or racial policies on college campuses. I declined that interview. 3 hours later, the American Conservative published a piece saying that I was calling for the killing of and genocide of white Americans. And this is literally 3 hours later, 3 to 4 hours later. So there's a big uproar that appears over a podcast I did in 2012 addressing killing white people in context, responding to how the conservatives in America had tried to attack Jamie Foxx. So Jamie Foxx was the main character of Django Unchained. And in his Saturday Night Live skit, he suggested that, or he said just flat out that he really enjoyed making Django, and it was fun for him to kill all the white people who had enslaved black Americans. The conservatives went into an uproar, suggesting that he was advocating violence against white people. And this was, again, a call for, direct action and killing white people in contemporary society. Jamie Foxx said, listen, I'm a comedian. It's a joke. Get over it. What I tried to do in my podcast, and this is the irony of the whole thing, is to say, listen, every time we talk about violence against whites, we do so as if it's a fantasy and a spectacle, something that never happened.
Right.
And what I tried to show is that there were concrete actions for liberation, like slave revolts in the case of, say, Nat Turner, or actual civil rights movements, as in the case of T. Thomas Fortune and Ida B. Wells, or Mabel Williams and Robert F. Williams, or the Black Panther Party, or Deacons of Defense, where Black people had to arm themselves and take up guns to protect their civil rights, the right to vote, the right to protest, to protect themselves from the police state where they were sticking dogs and water and fire hoses on them. Black people had to arm themselves to fight for the civil rights that we claim was actually given by the civil rights movement. And what I was trying to suggest is that there is a schism. There's a dissonance in the American mind between what civil rights was, which is where everybody says, oh, basically it was just Martin Luther King marching with people in the streets. And there were no, and it's a romantic vision, right? Because the idea is, Martin Luther King's nonviolence worked, as if there weren't violent protests and students being killed during the civil rights movement, right? This is the debate between Martin Luther King and Stokely Carmichael, is that how do we stay peaceful when people are killing and raping and mutilating our peaceful students who are just exercising, their right to protest. So in response to that, Black people took up arms to protect those groups, to protect students, to protect young men and women who were protesting for civil rights. And what I said was that in this way, you see a long history all the way back from the 19th century to the mid 20th century, where there are some Black people who held the view that in order for Black people to get liberated, some white people would have to die. Right. And that was the piece that was taken out of context. But when you look at the history, and this is why context is so important. When you look at the history, Black people have not been able to get civil rights in this country simply because they asked. Black people have not been able to get rights in this country simply because they marched. The issue is they had to destabilize society. And often that destabilization, as in the case with the Black Panther, meant that they exercised their Second Amendment rights. The case with Robert F. Williams is so important because before Robert F. Williams decided to arm himself, they were peaceful protesters, and white people were shooting into the Black crowd. They were shooting. He recounts that they were shooting a tree above the protesters' heads. So they reported this to the cop who was watching the protest, and he said he heard nothing. So Robert F. Williams argued that the rule of law failed to protect minorities. It failed to protect Black people's right to protest and peacefully assemble. So Black people had to arm themselves because the same white officer who didn't hear the gun being shot above the tree of the protesters also tried to kill him later, right? When his car spun off the road because the KKK was chasing him. So this is the history of civil rights. It's not white America laying down and saying that we made a mistake and we were wrong. It's been Black people having to fight to protect themselves under threat of life and limb, to protect their families, to protect jobs, right? I mean, to participate in civil rights during the 1950s and 60s was akin to being a terrorist. This is what Jackie Onassis said even about Martin Luther King. So we can't keep living in this romantic dream where the idea is, peaceful civil rights somehow worked, but the Black people who gave their lives and armed themselves to protect peaceful protesters, somehow that's the terroristic act. The terrorism, the violence is what white America did to Black and brown folk, to indigenous folks who wanted to be citizens and protested their whole lives to be able to enjoy the same constitutional rights as white Americans. And if that history offends white America, it needs to take a very good look in the mirror to look at what kind of violence like slavery or genocide did it perpetuate against these groups of people such that they had to respond with arms.
So Tommy, honestly, it's just like in the Declaration of Independence where it's very beautiful and everything, but this is whitewashing the fact that, this is a declaration about violence. When in the course of human events, if you treat us so unjustly, we're going to respond. We're going to separate from you, even if it takes force. And we're going to make sure we declare intelligently our causes for that. But, it's an incredible imbalance where people forget that that's even this sort of honorific documents. The founding documents were declarations about violence in a way.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And again, this is Eric, this is one of the reasons that black philosophy is so important. I mean, when David Walker makes the same charge in his appeal in 1829, he's building it off of the Declaration of Independence. He's saying,
but don't tread on me is on everybody's license plate.
Exactly. But that's what you remember the piece I said in the podcast was that self-defense is American except when it's applied to black Americans.
Right. Right.
And remember, the argument I made was that even talking about black people defending themselves from white violence, where white people would die because they were attacking black people, is censored in this country.
And that is exactly the irony of your story, because you're getting this crap exactly in the way you're saying. You get crap when you say this.
Exactly. And it's interesting because I'm not making a call from revolutionary violence. Remember, we had this argument in your office back in grad school, right? The argument is not the indiscriminate killing of white people. The argument is, given the violence of a society that is white supremacist, where you can kill people like Michael Brown, or you kill Tamir Rice, who's 12 years old, or just what we saw with the Philando Castile case, right? Like when that happens. Are black Americans supposed to cease thinking and saying, well, we can only be victims? Because the claim that Texas A&M's president was making, and the claim that the alt-right is making, is that we can never teach a history that shows black people fighting with their lives or with guns for their rights. That the only people who have the right to fight or bear arms to protect their livelihood or their humanity are white people.
I want to ask, and just let you tell the story. What did Texas A&M's leadership say in response when people were criticizing you for saying what it is someone took you to say?
Well, initially the response was that, my podcast was reprehensible and violent and, goes.
This is what your university president said.
Did he even listen to it?
I don't think so. And I point out constantly that, the most embarrassing part of that statement isn't just that a university president said it, but that the university president takes the American Conservative and the Daily Stormer to be legitimate sources of news. So it means that he was because the only people in the country that have even taken onto this story, if it's true, have been the American Conservative and white supremacist news outlets, right? Those are the only people who, even a month later, still try to reproduce this fabrication of what was said or what wasn't said. Snoops has settled the story. The Chronicle, Daily News, they've printed the transcripts. It's not there, right?
Just not.
Right.
It's just not there. So that means that a university, that Michael Young is the president of Texas A&M, said that white supremacists and alt-right news outlets were more trustworthy than the actually respected, peer-reviewed, or professional, venues and sources that we trust in the academy. Right? Everybody reads the Chronicle is right. It's the place that we get our news for the American universities. So I think it's an embarrassment, and I think it really shows how solidified this kind of trend of conservatism is as a place like Texas A&M, where even the alt-right, which is a openly white supremacist movement, has been able to have a hold on college administrations.
So, Tommy, you indicated in the last segment we were talking, you said that you had no support from your university president. Were there other administrators that maybe did support you at Texas A&M? Or was it just completely, were you sort of left flying in the wind, so to speak? I'm really sorry that happened to you.
No, well, thank you. I think it was kind of a mixed bag. On the one hand, I think Michael Young prematurely trusted his constituency.
This is the president of Texas A&M University, right?
Right. So Michael Young is the president of Texas A&M. So I think he was responding to the paranoia of donors and alumni. And I can tell you today, even Tex Ags, who call themselves the Unofficial Alumni Association, have been trying to put tremendous pressure on the administration to fire me. And they've started a hashtag called Not Another Dime until me, Sharp, and Young are fired. So this is a group that has insisted that there should be no Africana studies, there should be no women and gender studies, that A&M by hiring me was trying to change the culture into a University of California, Berkeley. So these are harsh conservatives and alt-right followers who fundamentally believe that the culture at Texas A&M is the linchpin of American conservatism, and that if it falls, that basically the world is going to hell in a handbasket. So this is the group that very much believes that I should no longer be at Texas A&M. And I think Young was responding to and enforcing the will of those kinds of people. On the other hand, I think you saw support from administrators like the provost, the vice provost of diversity, certainly the faculty. I was pleasantly surprised at the support that I received from the faculty at Texas A&M that were calling for protection of my academic freedom. And to be honest with you, this is the most shameful part of it. Because my situation differed in a lot of ways from other professors in that I didn't give a tweet, or, this wasn't a social media mishap. This was basically me I was on a syndicated show at Sirius XM, The Power and Rob Redding's Redding News Review. I was on that for about 2 or 3 years. And my position on Django Unchained was really consistent with the 4 or 5 publications I've actually, published and seen now in print on this area of research. It is my position that the militant civil rights movement had philosophical relevance for how we think about the notions of equality, and that militancy and pessimism, or the idea that whites will not simply be changed by moral suasion, has been the dominant view of Black Americans since the beginning of the 19th century in this country. That being said, what the president suggested was that those views are reprehensible. So he is effectively saying that even though these publications have been seen by 3 or 4 different, governing bodies within the university, that this podcast has been on my vita since I went up for tenure as an associate professor back in 2012, all these publications, all this research is simply reprehensible because it cuts against the dominant idea, or should I say whitewashed idea, of the civil rights movement, which suggests that Black people have no longer suffer institutionally from racism, that Black people are not the victims of hate crimes and violence, and that Black people should never respond with their Second Amendment right to self-defense. And again, I say that the irony of this is that we're at a university that claims that even teenagers, if they're in the military, or, if you're an adult, the age of 21, you could conceal carry within classrooms.
Wow.
It's a contradiction that is so stark that you can only say that it's racially insidious, right? Because it's a predominantly white campus. It's a overwhelmingly conservative campus that believes in campus carry and exercise of the Second Amendment, and then you choose to not endorse a Black professor who makes literally the same argument of self-defense of Black people protecting themselves against white vigilantes, white supremacist violence, and a police state that's violating their rights. That is literally the same argument that Texans make in terms of keeping their guns, even assault rifles, and their need to protect themselves from the encroachments of the state. So again, this shows, as I said in the podcast, that this only bothers people when Black people say that they have a right to self-defense, right? So overall, I think that kind of censorship really does threaten Black professors, not only at Texas A&M, but it's kind of a sign of the times to come. Academic freedom is going to become a very central issue in the upcoming years. And I think that college administrators have to really decide whether or not they serve the business interests of donors, or they actually govern and try to protect the intellectual traditions of universities. One of the things that, Michael Young said in a subsequent letter, they've released a few iterations of the letter that he was writing now with some open records requests on Texas Ags, is that, that he's struck by that. He disagrees with the idea that the university can't be used to educate people. So I assume that he's responding to the idea that, critical race theory says racism is permanent. So he fundamentally disagrees with the idea that white people cannot be educated out of their racism. But what's so interesting to me is he, on one hand, claims that we should be educating white people out of racism, but then he says that the ideas and histories that show the mistakes and shows the tyranny of white racism should be erased if they show something like militant self-defense or armed resistance against white people because they disagree with that. So
that's exactly irony and hypocrisy altogether.
So we should educate white people out of racism, but as long as that education doesn't teach or tell white people anything they already think they know about racism. It's absurd, right? It's absurd. And that's why you can tell that these responses are politically motivated, not intellectually motivated. There's not a black scholar teaching Africana that doesn't start with violence. The Haitian Revolution, Haiti was the first free black republic in modernity. And it happened because of violence. Black people became free from slavery because of violence. Black people won the civil rights movement because of violence. Black people fought in every revolutionary war in America, from the American Revolution to the Civil War, etc. Violence was involved. So to give a story of black people fighting for liberation, or even the story of America outside of revolutionary violence or self-defense, would be revisionist. But then when you place black people inside of that story, when you say that black people had an agency in that story, that black people took up arms, to protect their own rights, then somehow that becomes reprehensible. Right?
Well, we have the United States because of violence. We have the Confederate monuments because of violence. You know what I mean? Like it is an unbelievable hypocrisy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, and again, this is why I say, I think that in being in the academy at this period of time, it's going to really test the intellectual seriousness of professors, especially black professors, because this is going to be a period of time where universities have to decide, do they want black professors who are willing to stand up to the pressures of the alt-right and administrators to actually endorse academic freedom and intellectual pursuit? And I think that that's going to be a much taller task. This isn't going to be the simple decision of, well, let's just hire people from Yale and Harvard. This is going to be a decision of whether or not people have the kind of intellectual character and courage to fight against a public which says that they should not exist. And I think that especially when you're going to talk about issues of racism in this country, because those conversations predominantly involve non-whites, right? It's not like when you talk about sexism, because you're talking about white women and, you're talking about white people still. But when you start talking about issues of racism that are going to involve questions of Islamophobia, xenophobia, right? Protectionist policies, racism, imperialism, when you start holding in on those fundamental questions, given that America has decided that it is in fact now a white republic, even though it always has been, but now is paranoid about losing that. These are going to generate political controversy and in many cases may actually escalate into violence, given the threat that's coming, the threat on professors' lives that's coming. This is going to be a very different calculus, right? That if you want these conversations to happen, it's going to be happening in brimstone and fire.
Well, Tommy, you talked about, say recalculating. I mean, have these events sort of made you rethink the way you're going to be approaching philosophy, or at least publicly presenting your ideas in the future? Or is it just sort of emboldened you further? Has there been some thought on this?
Well, there's been lots of thought on it, honestly. And I think, it's one of those things, in this, I didn't do anything wrong. I did exactly. I did what I was hired to do. I've published God knows how many articles on these issues, and they're in extremely very visible and prestigious venues. So I guess I'm confronted as a black man in America with the idea that I should somehow be quiet because white racists are angry at what I say. That just doesn't go down too smoothly. So as of now, my answer is no. It has not changed what I'm going to say because again, it's one thing. It's one thing. Like if we take the worst case scenario, let's say I call for revolutionary violence, right, against whites. That's still protected in academic speech. I can write about revolution. I can be an anarchist. That is my freedom as a professor. Right. In this case, I didn't do that because I'm much more interested in the Second Amendment, right? Which is very interesting because, they focused on one article I published in 2007 questioning whether or not we need a self-defense model or a revolutionary violence model. But everything I've written since in the last decade has been about the Second Amendment. And the reason that I think that's so important is because it's something that is grounded within the understanding and tradition how Black Americans chose to speak about violence. It's what Black people historically have chosen to say about their relationship to violence against white supremacy. So for me to say that I'm going to censor a whole area of my research because, white supremacists find it offensive, I mean, we should be offending white supremacists, right?
They don't want to hear the truth.
Yeah, they don't want to hear the truth. So if a white supremacist isn't offended by my views on race, then God knows what am I doing, right?
Right.
Like this is the point, right? If it's the same way that someone who supports Nazism should be offended by the work they're doing at the Shoah, right? These counter narratives, this research exists to offend the oppressor. Because the oppressor is trying to impose a certain will and silence and in many ways genocide on the lives and existence and histories of the oppressed. So just because we're in this political moment where the alt-right and white supremacists have a public forum, I am not dissuaded either to lessen my academic freedom or to lessen the integrity of my research simply because they exert some pressure.
I'm happy to hear that you're going to continue with your work because I think it's very important and powerful work you're doing.
Thank you.
That's
now,
right.
Whether I continue in the academy is a different issue, but I'm certainly going to continue the work.
Tommy, I was in Mississippi for 9 years, and I was advocating a lot for justice, and I got modest threats. Nothing, I say modest, I mean, they troubled me, and I was anxious, and I don't know that I'd say I lost sleep, but I mean, it was difficult to take that, and it was nothing like the level of what you've gotten. So my question, we've only got about a minute and a half left here. My question is, have you lost sleep? Tell us about the experience you've undergone, what you've been feeling.
Well, I mean, it does bother you. You know, I think, you know, when I was at SIU and I wrote for the paper, I used to get death threats too.
Really?
Yes.
This is Southern Illinois University, folks.
Yeah, so when I used to write for the Daily Egyptian, I used to write about race issues and people would threaten my life then. But, I was a young man, it didn't bother me as much. Now with a family, you kind of think about things a little differently,
right?
Because it's not just you that's trying to take on the world. It's about what the world would do to the people you love and care about.
Yeah.
And that changes the calculation a bit. So my fears have largely come from making sure that my family, my daughters are safe. On the other hand, however, it does embolden me a bit because think about it. If the conversation about Black people defending themselves from a history of violence. I mean, we see case after case. We see white vigilante after white vigilante attacking Black people, Muslims, etc. If me talking about that means that these people are going to threaten my life, then what are we negotiating with? So if speech leads to death threats and people saying they want to kill you because they disagree with you, then what is the state of our democracy that says that the burden of saying things to not get killed becomes on the people who are reading, trying to improve society, and not the people who are utilizing violence and death to try to destroy it?
Right.
And I think that, and again, that's a real question that these universities and these administrators have to ask themselves. I mean, what does it mean for a university president to say we find the conversation about Black people's self-defense, or let's assume he assumed it was revolutionary violence offensive, but I support, or at least I'm not going to say anything about all the people trying to threaten this professor and his family. What is the contradiction? And again, from my viewpoint, it can only be racism, because there's no way that you can tell me that I got 60 to maybe 80 death threats. There's no way you can tell me, well, that's not against Aggie values. But God forbid this full professor that researches militant civil rights actually says that Black people have a right to defend themselves from white tyranny. That's what's so offensive. So I think that it shows that part of the values that the Aggie conservatives have is the depreciation of Black, brown, and indigenous life. That these are certain groups that A&M has traditionally and even contemporarily doesn't value as much as other white conservatives. And that's a reality that the institution and I think other universities that look at Texas A&M have to reconcile with.